Okay, do you understand me loud and clearly? Great. Okay, great. Yes, everybody joined who was registered, I guess. Just for information, we already started the recording, so this webinar will record it, and we will put it later on YouTube and Facebook for people to rewatch. Unfortunately, we will not stream it live on Facebook now. The link is broken, but we will put it for people for rewatch. And during the webinar, still everyone can register and join us. So if you have people who would like to join, just tell them to use the Zoom link and they can join us anytime. My name is Cédric Reichel. I'm co-coordinator of the Climate Alliance Luxembourg for ASTM, Action Solidarité Tiers-Monde. I will host this webinar, but I will also make a small presentation. I was at the COP26 together with my colleague Birgit Engel, who will be our first panelist today. I also welcome Beverly Longid from the Philippines, who will tell us her perspective on the COP26. And later, Selma Vincent from Youth for Climate Luxembourg will join us. She's still in a seminar, she's a student, but she promised us to join us as soon as possible. I'm sure she will make it. Apart from being registered, I want to inform you that you can at any time use the chat. And also there's a Q&A. So if you have a question you want to directly ask the panelists, I would prefer that you ask that you put that question in the Q&A, and technical questions or more general questions could be, therefore we would ask you to use the chat. I hope that the quality of the internet connection will be good on every side. Also for information, I'm in the offices of ASTM together with my colleague Lisa Even, who is responsible for the technical questions on this webinar. Okay, so our webinar is called Perspectives and Reflections on the COP26. We are talking about the COP26 in Glasgow, which finished 2 weeks ago. We of ASTM had the possibility to give tickets, registrations to some people. We helped some young activists to join the webinar, to join the COP26 in Glasgow. And we could also offer a ticket to a partner organization of us, who unfortunately only could join the COP virtually, not in presence. We will talk about this question later in detail, I'm sure. So as an aftermath of this COP26, we wanted to briefly give the perspectives of 4 very different people who were in Glasgow, who experienced, each of us, a very different COP, who had a different level of influence, level of also expectations, I think, and also a different agenda, a different task, what they were supposed to do in Glasgow. Therefore, I think the most important would be to get an overview of the main decisions being taken at the COP26, and maybe also how on a political level the policies of COP26 can be resumed. Maybe, Birgit, I would give you now the spots.
Yes, thank you very much. I just sent a presentation. Could we start the presentation?
You can share the screen.
Okay, so everybody sees the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, that's what actually that's what Cédric already.
Wait, sorry, Birgit, we don't see the first slide. We just see the overview of the slides.
Okay. So what about now?
Give us a second.
Well, I have the presentation view here, but if this doesn't work, maybe you could share the presentation.
Yes, I will open it now, and maybe I can share it.
Okay, maybe meanwhile I can already start. Some of the people who are participating today already we already had the opportunity to talk about the outcomes and our impressions on the COP. As ASTM, it was not the first time we participated in the COP, but it was the first time for Cédric and me. And we agreed with our advocacy group on a press release in advance to share our views, our expectations on the COP, which concentrated especially on 3 different issues. First of them was throughout the weeks and months before the COP, there were already big discussions on the unequal access to the COP. That was one of our main issues, as also some of our partner organizations really had difficulties not only getting accreditations, but really to fulfill the conditions concerning vaccinations, etc., and getting visa in time. So it already announced itself. This COP already announced itself really as a kind of exclusive COP, although it was really announced otherwise. It was supposed to be the most inclusive COP ever, which really turned out to be not the case. And so we concentrated in our press release on this issue, as well as loss and damage, which I will describe later on. And the third focus for us were the nature-based solutions, our impressions and our recommendations on that, and I will also come back to that later on. So can we start? Yeah, so we can start the presentation now. First of all, I would like to give you a small overview on the expectations and the outcomes of the Paris Agreement. So what was at stake now at COP26 in Glasgow? And these are especially the several topics, like, for example, can we next slide, please? Next one. So what was the outcomes or the task, in fact, of the Paris Agreement? All in all, as a global view, it was to limit the rise of the global temperature to 1.5 degrees. And also a task, the expectations to the states to reach climate neutrality until 2050. But one of the most important facts was, in fact, the fair distribution of the measures between not only generations, but especially nations. So between North and South, different tasks and different possibilities where to start. And this has become really crucial now at COP26 in Glasgow. The support of climate resilience also refers to all these possibilities and decisions on climate adaptation and mitigation, and we'll also come back to that later. A very important point are the common timeframes, so that the states really find a consensus on when to deliver and when to take decisions and put forward their own objectives. And last but not least, the famous Article 6, which is about the international emission trading. And after the Paris Agreement in 2015, there were, well, for 3 or 4 years, there was not very much announced concerning, for example, these nationally determined contributions. And as a consequence of this, IPCC published a special report on the 1.5 degrees, where I would like to give you some, well, a very short overview of what the difference between 1.5 and 2.0 means. Next slide, please. So if we consider 1.5 and 2.0, of course, the difference is not very big. But what does it mean if we have a global temperature rise of 1.5 or 2.0? Just to give you two situations, two scenarios on what that would mean. For example, if we consider weather extremes, very extreme weather conditions, like, for example, floodings caused by typhoons or by storms. So if we have a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees, this would occur every 100 years. But if it's only half a degree more, then we would this occurrence would go down already to 33 years, which is very, considering only half a degree, which is enormous rising of this danger of storm flooding. Concerning, for example, the the disappearance, the melting of the ice in the Arctic Sea, there we also have a very significant difference in 1.5 degrees and 2.0. So if we have 1.5 degrees rise, then the Arctic would be ice-free only once in 100 years. If we have a 2.0 degree, then it would be in 10 years out of 100, where we would have a totally ice-free Arctic Sea. So these two examples, they already show the importance of the measures that were at stake at COP26. Next slide, please. So concerning the common timeframes I just mentioned from the Paris Agreement, what does it mean? So parties have to agree to a certain time frame to implement the climate change measures, and to focus afterwards on the nationally determined contributions, the so-called NDCs, which means they have to publish or to decide on measures how to reduce their CO2 emissions on a national level. And this was this was discussed, or this was decided in Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. And already throughout the last years, those states who already had published the nationally determined contributions, they already showed that it was by far not enough to reach the goals. And so there was a discussion on a common time frame in which period these NDCs have to be updated. And that was also a big discussion at COP26, just before the EU had agreed on a 5 years time frame, like also the vast majority of the countries, especially those who are severely concerned by climate change, the LDCs and the Africa Group, etc. But during the COP, China and the US, they agreed, they made the proposal to have a 10 years common time frame starting in 2025, where they wanted to submit their own nationally determined contributions up to 2035. Sorry. Next slide, please. A second challenge, which we already mentioned in our own press release, was of course loss and damage. Already at COP19 in 2013 in Poland, the international mechanism for loss and damage was established and decided upon as a as one of the most important issues and challenges to address the losses and damages that in vulnerable countries had already occurred due to climate change. The implementation of this international mechanism has to be guided by the executive committee, the UNFCCC, but under the guidance of the COP, so that this mechanism should always be closely linked to the COP and to the responsibility of all the states. One of a very important step was made by the establishment, by establishing the Santiago Network at the end of last year. This UN body is supposed to catalyze the technical assistance on loss and damage. So not to be responsible for any questions on financing, but to make, for example, research on the ground in vulnerable countries where these where the money really has to be, where the money really has to go to, which populations, which people do these finance most because of high damages in their livelihood, etc. So that is the one side, but what was actually missing until now was really a fund where the states can contribute to really to address, to do this task, to make the Santiago network really operational. So the assistance for relevant averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, there the initiative has also come from the countries themselves, countries affected, so that they can really contact the Santiago network. What so far happened on financial level is really, well, I can't call it otherwise than ridiculous. During the COP, there have only been two commitments, one of Wallonia Brussels Federation, the other one of Scotland, and all the two of them made a commitment for €1 million, respectively 1 million pounds, to go to that fund for loss and damage. So that was all that, concerning the outcomes of the COP26 on loss and damage. Next slide, please. The third point from our press release, the nature-based solutions, are a very contradictory point with lots of criticism throughout the last years. According to the International Union of Conservation of Nature, the nature-based solutions, they describe actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal changes effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So it's a very high demands to nature-based solutions. But when we have a look at what has come out of it, or how these nature-based solutions have developed throughout the last years, then we discover lots of big investments from multinational corporations. We discover lots of land grabbing in the name of nature-based solutions, and these are two of the main criticisms concerning these nature-based solutions. For example, in projects like coastal zone management, forest landscape restoration, also green infrastructure, etc. There's a whole bunch of different possibilities for these nature-based solutions, but nearly all of them have really been affected meanwhile by big investments, by a really big scale land grabbing, etc. So that caused one of our partners, Acción Ecológica from Ecuador, to say there are really no small-scale nature-based solutions that are possible, because that was what we as ACM had in mind, really to focus on a small scale, as we have many partners who really developed adaptation measures, but also mitigation projects on a small scale that can be also transferred to different regions, to other partner organizations, etc. But Acción Ecológica told us during the COP, it's simply not possible to call it a small-scale nature-based solutions, as alone this terminology is really so influenced so negatively that we can't keep the same terminology for good examples and for those actually happening. And yeah, of course, we might discuss on that later on. Next slide, please. Concerning adaptation and mitigation, this has not only been now during the COP, but also in the months before, has been an issue on the international political agenda, also in Luxembourg. As you might know, Luxembourg planned for the period of 2021 to, for the next 5 years, 220 million euros for different climate-related projects or funds. But concerning the adaptation and the percentage of adaptation and mitigation, many or most of the states present at the COP have not so far addressed the changement of the percentage of the funding they want to give to adaptation and to mitigation. So far, it has always been 80 for adaptation and 20 for mitigation, which already reflects one of the biggest problems, that the mitigations, so the measures you can take at home, they're really, they are reduced in a very progressive way. In fact, so that the states are not obliged to do most of the emission reduction at home. And this was, of course, one of our biggest points of criticism. Also, during the COP, new financial contributions have been announced, which is good news. For example, the 100 million for the UNFCCC adaptation fund from the EU budget. So many EU states and also the Commission, they had, they made commitments during the COP. Concerning the role of Luxembourg in these negotiations, Luxembourg was, in person of Carol Dieschbruck, she was asked to lead these negotiations because of the known the known role of Luxembourg in financing adaptation mitigation. But concerning the outcomes, we would have expected that they would also address the question on this 80-20 percentage, also for not only for Luxembourg, but that they would also invest or engage to convince other European countries to change this percentage. Unfortunately, that was not the case. On the famous Article 6, so the emission trading that was addressed in the Paris Agreement, which is of course still possible. So, for example, bilateral contracts, for example, between states to reduce emissions are still possible. And one of the main problems was so far the transparency. So in which projects is the money invested, or which projects do these emission reductions go to? And also the question of the private sector investments. They were still there, and it still remained the question on this transparency, on which the COP26 has not really how to put that, has not really made any progress. And these are questions that will stay not only for the next COP27, but this is also a question or a task for other civil society organizations to go on trying to find ways to keep this on the political agenda and to address it long before COP27 in 2022. And we can go on discussing this later.
We will now, as a second speaker, we will have Selma, who has a good connection. I see it already for some minutes. Selma Vincent is with us today. She is a member of Youth for Climate Luxembourg. She's project manager at undergraduate student at Sciences Po Environnement in Reims. She was a delegate at COP26 and a Luxembourg youth delegate at the pre-COP26. Maybe she will also tell us something about that. And Le Quotidien mentioned that she would be the only déléguée de Youth for Climate présente à la conférence mondiale sur le climat. Maybe you can explain us if that was correct. Who else you met there? Thanks for being with us. The stage is yours.
Of course, thank you very much. Just making sure you can hear me. Perfect. Yes, I was indeed the only youth participant for Luxembourg, unfortunately. It felt quite lonely. I mean, at some point, eventually I was able to meet with the Luxembourgish delegation, but it's true that being the only youth there was quite a strange feeling because usually as youth activist movements, we're a group, right? And that's something that we really value. However, the Luxembourg delegation had invited us in the beginning, and then last moment they told us, no, sorry, you can't come. We don't have any more room. So that was quite disappointing for all of us. But thankfully, ASTM very nicely gave me accreditation to come for the first week. But obviously, you didn't have that much space either for other young activists, and you have your own activists. So yeah, I was the only one able to participate in the end. And unfortunately, it felt also that I was the only youth delegate, not only just for Luxembourg, but just in general. It felt very lonely because most of the conference had a age average that was nowhere near mine. So just as a whole, it felt there was really a lack of the youth movement there present at all. And I mean, Birgit, you pointed that out quite well. It was not at all as inclusive as we'd expected it or wanted it to be. Not only could NGOs not really participate in many of the negotiations, but neither could the actual youth delegates of the countries. So like my friends who are youth delegates for Iceland and for Norway, they couldn't even get into their own delegations at the negotiations because everything was so restricted. So that really just goes to say how much our voices were not very much heard. And even in the case of the pre-COP, which was exclusively for youth. So it was me and then my friend Elisha, who you may know, who is also quite active in the climate movement in Luxembourg. We both went there representing the interests, or rather the ambition we want for our country. And then we came up with a manifesto along with the 398 other young activists of the world who came. However, we were never really told how that manifesto was actually going to be taken into consideration by the negotiations and by the delegations. And then the presidents, Alok Sharma, and the presidents of COP26 and of pre-COP26 both invited us for a meeting with all of the young activists who were there, not only at pre-COP, but also COP, to kind of see how they could include us. Or so we thought, because it was kind of in the context of their youth day. So we went full of hope, full of ambition, and hopefully trying to get the leaders of these two huge events to include our voices in the decisions taken. However, we were very sorely disappointed. It felt much more like a youth washing event, if anything. When I raised the question to Alok Sharma, how maybe next year even more delegations could include our manifesto, he really didn't have an answer. And in fact, the president of pre-COP kind of got mad at me, and not only just at me, but kind of to every single delegate who had the audacity to bring up a point of feedback or criticism. It was actually quite unprofessional and very patronizing, the tone that was taken with us, which we found very unfortunate, because here we are at the most ambitious conference the world has ever seen, and yet when we propose ambitious measures, you think we're not appreciative of your work that's already been done. I don't know, it just felt very strange and very counterproductive to the very pure purpose of the meeting. But it wasn't all bad, because okay, apart from the actual decisions that were taken in the Glasgow agreements, the positive, I think, impact of COP was the activism that took place there. So whether it was outside, as you may know, the Fridays for Future movement, we had a Fridays for Future march on the first Friday of the first week. And we were like 60,000, and it was really huge. And Greta gave her amazing speech at the end. The next day, it was 120,000 of us. So it was not only the youth, but also the other activist movements like Extinction Rebellion, all those really cool groups in the UK and worldwide coming together and protesting the lack of ambition. And that was quite amazing. Then Vanessa Nakate and other wonderful activists from the Pacific and indigenous people gave really strong speeches, which I thought really contrasted with the lack of ambition that was going on inside of COP with the leaders. And so globally, that was quite wonderful to see. And the most that we could do also was protesting on the inside. So there was a moment, an instance where, as a Luxembourgish delegate, I organized with other European delegates to have a protest inside of COP, like in the blue zone. And our message was Europe pay up, because obviously, as Birgit so nicely put it, the European Union and just in general, like the northern delegations are not taking their responsibility enough when it comes to adaptation and mitigation, but especially loss and damage. So our message was just one of urgency and one of more, just responsibility. It didn't pan out that way, unfortunately, but we're not losing our hopes. We are hopeful for next year. And in fact, that's something that I brought up to the Luxembourg delegation. I was able to meet with our Minister of the Environment, Karel Dierschbourg, to kind of raise the point of trying to align our demands with hers. I think she's quite a wonderful minister, and she took the time to actually listen. And globally, I think our interests are pretty much aligned. And it seems that she is really fighting for not only Luxembourgish interests, but especially like the cooperation with the Global South. And I also brought up the point that I was kind of surprised that Luxembourg did not have an official and institutionalized place for youth delegates with the UN representing Luxembourg. At first, she was quite, I guess, shocked that I would even ask such a thing from her. But then when I put it out that it was kind of common practice in many other countries, like Mexico, I believe their negotiation floor is mostly young people in their 20s. It didn't seem that much of an outrageous ask. So I'm going to be working with her and her team, hopefully over the next year, in order to see how we can include a youth participants and hopefully an activist youth participants within the delegation, because it's a really, really important point of view to have. And it's one that we don't have enough. And I'm not saying that Luxembourg doesn't have enough ambition. I think it has a significant amount of ambition. But as we know, the youth movement is, I think, the one that really keeps the government accountable all the time, keeps it on its toes, and keeps it to its promises. So that was kind of what I went to COP to do. Was everything concluded as well as I would have liked? No, but I'm still hopeful for next year, hopefully. But also, that's another thing we were talking about with just other youth activists. Why do we need so many COPs? Why isn't one COP enough? Like, why do we need COP27 and 28 and 29 and 30? When is it going to stop? And when are we going to realize that we don't have until COP45 to figure out the climate crisis? It's now or never. So that was my contribution. I don't know if you have any questions, but yes.
Thank you very much, Selma.
Thank you.
For this first overview. I now look in the chat. So far, there are no questions. If anyone wants to put a question now, I would have a question actually, maybe now before you will leave us soon, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have classes.
Yeah, it's just one question. Are there already talks going on inside of Youth for Climate about your involvement in future COPs? Is it already, or are you now doing a debrief, or are you more already in planning the next involvement?
It's more about, yeah, I mean, not so much just Youth for Climate. I think we just think it's important as a whole, whether it's us or anybody, any other competent youth, that somebody of our age gets involved. Because the people of our age, I think in Luxembourg at least, are the only people who really sense and understand the measure of emergency. So one interesting thing as well that I'm doing in parallel just with my school, because I'm a student in France at Sciences Po, is we're trying to get official accreditation from our school so that students don't have to like go and ask 30,000 NGOs. People might not have those connections. So trying to get it at the source so that the university engages their students to go and attend these meetings. So that's something that I'm doing actively with Sciences Po Environnement. But then with Youth for Climate, that's something more, I guess, institutionalized within the actual government, because we have that privilege, I think, and we have that platform where it's such a small country that we're actually able to have a casual conversation with Karel Giersburg, or yeah, so it's something that we're discussing. Not so much our involvement. I mean, we'd love to get involved with this, with the government and keep having the discussions. I mean, we met with the economy minister over the summer. We met with the Betel recently as well, Karel Giersburg. It's like something that we do a lot. So yeah, it is though in discussion how we can make it as efficient as possible. I know that I will be working, because that's my personal conviction is like, it's especially important for us to be out in the streets, but if there's nobody to keep accountability within the negotiation rooms, we can't be sure how much of an impact we really made.
So your answer to the question how organizations or coalitions could get more involved into negotiations is that you're currently doing that by having regular meetings, by trying to influence leaders, right?
Definitely. That's something ever since we started, really, I think right after our first protest in March 2019, is we met with the Prime Minister, because obviously having protests and huge movements is super important, but I think what's even more important is their impact. So making sure that our demands are heard, and if our leaders are so courteous as to actually give us time out of their day to come and speak with us, we see that as a huge opportunity that a lot of youth, for instance, in the Global South, do not have. So yeah, making our voices as heard as loud as possible is definitely our priority.
Okay, so to resume, you don't question your involvement in the COP as Youth for Climate. You say it's the right thing to do.
Yes, I mean, obviously we would prefer a more efficient and more, yeah, just a more efficient and more urgent platform that actually works and that needs to be renewed every single year. But if it's the only thing that we have, and it's the only way we have to keep, yeah, just to convey the sense of emergency, then yes, definitely no questions involved. I think it's super important that every single activist should be inside, and in my opinion, should be the ones doing the negotiations. But yeah.
Okay, thanks so much for joining us,
Thank
Selma. I will now move on. I think you are not in the spotlight anymore, so I will change that. Yes, and I will now show the video of Beverly Longid. Beverly Longid is the coordinator of the Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation of the Philippines. She is Igorot, belonging to the Bontoc Cancanes of Sagada and Alba in the Philippines. She has a background in law and has been a long-standing advocate for youth and for Indigenous people in the Philippines and abroad. We met in Glasgow, of course, and you have a very interesting perspective because you have been all the time with people who have had access to the official COP, but you had to stay outside. And maybe you can explain us, yeah, more in detail how that happened and what you did and what is your perspective also with your backgrounds on the COP.
Thanks, Cédric. Thank you, ASTM, for inviting us to share our reflections and perspectives on the recently concluded COP26. Yes, I was part, no, the IPM-SDL was part of the delegation actually of a wider coalition, which we call the Southern People's Action on COP26, no. So this is a campaign, how do you say it, a campaign caucus of different movements, community and people's organizations, especially from the Global South, mainly to coordinate actions leading up to, during, and after the after COP26. So this coalition works with trade unions, women, youth organizations, and indigenous peoples organizations, and we have actually supported some community or country actions prior to COP26. This coalition also coordinated with the International League of People's Struggles, which is a global alliance of anti-imperialist organizations. And we were also part of the COP26 coalition. And of course, we coordinated also with with the civil society in Glasgow, no, to ensure the representation and voices of Southern movements in all of the events and activities for COP26. Pero as you mentioned, however, our efforts, despite our efforts, our best efforts, many of our colleagues could not attend. But it's a combination of different factors, multiple factors. One would be the issue of visa and accreditation problems. As you mentioned, only those who are actually would have ECOSOC status under the UN or even accredited within the UNFCCC can actually attend the official functions, no, not necessarily the negotiations per se, but they can enter the so-called blue zone or the official the spaces, and those who are not accredited for COP26 can only participate in activities in the so-called green zone, or it's outside of the official process. And it's actually divided also into portions, like others can be accredited only for the first week, others can be accredited for the second week, others can get the accreditation for the whole 2 weeks. But there would be limited number of badges per organization. So that was actually one of the limitations. In my case, I was only able to get accreditation for the first week, while my other colleagues were able to get accreditation for the whole 2 weeks. So I was only able to participate in the official events in the first week. Well, of course, there was also a problem of, the issue of, if you're coming from the Global South, from developing countries, the issue of access, the lack of access or no access at all for COVID vaccination. And this would actually make travel difficult because some of the countries would require that you should be fully vaccinated before you travel out. Of course, there's also this very clear, unclear, or always consistently changing rules of foreign travel, whether you need to do this test, you need to do quarantine before and after. So these were actually problems. Definitely, the cost of travel is higher. And of course, because now with the requirements for quarantine and everything, it makes it even more expensive. In the case of Glasgow, I heard that there was actually a scarcity of accommodations. So this actually increased the price of accommodation. So in the first week of, in Glasgow, in the first week, it was quite chaotic. I don't know, Selma, if you experienced this, that, you had to line up in a single entrance for you to undergo this COVID-19 and security checks, no? And it was very, very cold. So it was quite difficult to do it. Therefore, and then secondly, there was restrictions, as I mentioned, to the negotiating areas. At first, they said that you have to be registered and only those who had tickets could enter, but eventually this was removed. But nonetheless, if you can, if I heard that I think only 4 of the members of civil society were able to get the what you call this, the permit to enter into the official negotiation spaces. And then, well, they had this idea of, well, you can view the actual negotiations online through an overflow room, but even that was also restricted because of the issue of physical distancing. So it was not really that much accessible. I think, aside from state representatives, government representatives, there were actually very, very few indigenous peoples and local communities who were able to travel to Glasgow. But for the very few who were able to travel, they were not given this much space. So I think more than corporate officials and more of the lobbyists, this very few number of indigenous peoples and local communities should have been given the opportunity to speak. But despite that, were we able to achieve something? Were we able to do something good? I think for me, one of the great achievements in this COP26 is that civil society and social movements did not buckle down even with all of these limitations and restrictions. And I would give high commendations to our youth. I think every day who are out in the streets, and every day we're finding creative means to do all of these protests within the blue zone. And of course, to my fellow brothers and sisters, indigenous peoples who would also be out in the cold of Glasgow to be able to articulate the issues. And of course, congratulations to everybody because we had a very successful march. It was raining the whole day. It was very cold, yet people came out still in their numbers. I think the expectation was something like 10,000, but we had more than 100,000. And this climate march in Glasgow was made more stronger or more visible by also the hundreds or thousands that also march in different parts of the world. In other words, the protest was not only in Glasgow, but it was happening all over. And I think that's something that we should look as a great achievement, no? And then of course, I think because of these protests, being able to go beyond these restrictions and limitations, I would like to believe that these have further exposed the failure, the fallacy of COP. I think the COP was unable really, if you look into all of the discussions and what Birgit has mentioned, was unable to come out with really solutions to arrest climate change. I would like to think that it was also a failure. The failure of governments and states to address the issue was also exposed in Glasgow. But still, much has to be done, no? I think for one, aside from looking into better participation in the coming COP, we have to really remain very watchful and vigilant to look into these beautifully worded phrases or agreements. We have to be careful also and be able to counter these reworded fallacies and greenwashing tactics. So I think there's still much to do as far as being able to demand, that those who have benefited, those who have made themselves rich and who've gathered their wealth from fossil fuels and all of this extractive industry should still have the accountability to lead in reducing emissions and support the most affected communities and peoples to be able to adapt to climate impacts and to help them transition into something that's more sustainable. So I think it was also quite disappointing and disenchanting that despite the science on the issue of 1.5 degrees Celsius, it was still actually business as usual for multinational and transnational companies. Large-scale mining, agricultural, and all of this, there was really no mention as far as stopping it. In fact, they're expanding. There is no stop to dams and coal. In fact, there was still the continuing argument of dams, hydropower dams being renewable. despite its destruction. Birgit mentioned about COP26 pledging still 100 billion every year, supposedly to help poor and developing countries adapt to climate change. But remember, this was also a promise that they did 10 years ago, but they were not able. It was a broken promise, and then now they're doing another pledge. And some would argue like they don't have the money. But take a look at this. This amount, $100 billion every year, is actually very, very small compared to what countries who are part of NATO have pledged or actually giving to increase their war budgets. If I'm not mistaken, according to the data, is that NATO countries are actually pledged something like 200 billion annually increase in terms of military budgets since 2015. So now we have a bigger a bigger budget chest for war, but you have a very, very small budget chest when it comes to environment. Now, granting that the parties would really keep up to their pledge of 100 billion dollars per year, there's really a question of how they will use these funds. And this we have to be very, very vigilant about this, because the funds might go to so-called carbon fixes, quick fixes, what do you call this, nature-based or community-based solutions, which are basically nothing but a new look using the name of nature and community for these carbon markets. Now we hear of net zero, where emissions of greenhouse are supposedly balanced by technologies, removing them from the atmosphere. It sounds good. And I think in principle, it might be a good idea. However, this would create also the impression that technology will save us from climate change, and it would actually dilute the need, that, or the sense of urgency regarding addressing climate change now, not in 2030, not in 2050. I mean, we have to do it now, and there's something concrete has to be done. I agree with what Birgit said, that there was really less talk on loss and damages. And of course, there was lesser talk as far as historical debt of developed nations to peoples and nations ravaged from the time of colonization. I'm looking at this from the perspective of indigenous peoples and colonized peoples, because we should not forget that it was also colonization, that brought in devastation in many of the countries in the third world. In fact, relating to the pandemic, it was also colonization that brought in fatal diseases that nearly wiped out First Nations in the Americas and in other colonies. And this actually continues with modern day deforestation. And there is no talk in COP to stop it. No, so I do agree with the youth of today when they describe COP26 as same as in previous conference of parties. It was all for show, and as they said, it was all blah blah blah. I mean, nothing. So now, shall we participate in the next upcoming COP with all of this? I think definitely. I mean, I would agree with what Selma said. There might be limitations, but there are spaces. And if the spaces are shrinking, we should call for more spaces. Now, the next COP will be held in Egypt. I think because there's an expectation that it should be in Africa. I think because one, the issues of climate finance, adaptation, and all of this is something that's also of particular importance to Africa, which is also like Asia or any part of the world is home to many vulnerable people. However, there is really much concern given that the current Egyptian regime is seen as one of the most repressive regimes in the country, or even the history of Egypt. Similar to many countries in Asia, or like in the Philippines where I come from, it has outlawed dissent. It has suppressed political organizing, and in fact, it has banned street protests. So there are also thousands of political prisoners. So this is something that we will also have to look into, because this would put the local activists or local organizations and those coming in from outside to join the COP at risk. No, it might be difficult even to coordinate with local activists in Egypt, because this might also put them in great danger. So what am I saying? Probably my last 2 points. While we do agree that what we had in COP was to keep the conversations going in relation to 1.5 degrees Celsius, etc. But I think this should not be enough, no? Just to continue the conversation. Maybe we also need to heighten the conversation on what are the roots of the climate emergency. And I would like to believe that at the root of this is the issue of capitalist greed, the issue of the drive for profit, and it's also the issue of even the drive for profit that would also extend to the issues in relation to peace and security, wars of aggression, and occupation. So one thing that I think that we learned also in COP is that the solution to climate change is not with governments or corporations. It's with the people who are united in their number. And so as far as indigenous peoples are concerned, we will still continue with our task of being stewards of land and creation, and still try to contribute solutions to climate change based on our traditions and practice. So a bigger challenge now, I think, is how do we further build and strengthen the climate movement? And I think this should also be done alongside a wider and broader movement against imperialism. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beverly. Yes, this was very interesting to hear from you. And yeah, you have a very different insight than the other panelists we have today. I don't see any questions so far. There's a discussion going on in the chat, which is great. But there's no direct question, and we are already short in time. So I would suggest that I will continue with my small presentation now, and maybe there is time for a last question from the chat later. So I will now, yeah, so I will share my screen. I think you see it now. Okay, I will briefly raise the question: how does civil society engagement look like at the COP and outside of the COP? And was the COP26 in Glasgow more than a bubble? This is the famous action room on the left, where there was the world, and mostly there were talks there between young activists and journalists. Journalists were crowding around that area all the time. So that was called the action room. And on the right, you see me together with Phil Crowther, a journalist who was Birgit is raising the hand. Why? Okay. Who was with me in the blue zone, and we were having a small discussion there, and that was very interesting because as he was reporting from the COP inside for 2 weeks, he asked me what's happening outside. Is the COP more than what I see here at the conference center? And I said yes. This is the area. You see the main COP sites. They were at the River Clyde. It was a huge exhibition center. Of course, it was very restricted access and a lot of police around. It's also important to mention that the blue zone and the green zone, they are UN territory, meaning not Scottish territory anymore during that time, meaning inside you only have the UN security forces who are responsible. But the COP was everywhere in Glasgow. You were seeing it at all stations. You were seeing it in the shopping venues, in the center. You were seeing everywhere graffitis, posters welcoming people to the COP26 in Glasgow. COP in, COP out. Yeah, there were signs everywhere. There were very different ones. There were also companies marketing their involvement in the COP. For example, Nestle was very active there. So you had to take care which posters you are watching and how you're reading them. Sometimes it was different. And on the right, you see a picture from the Botanical Garden where there were school classes involved for months preparing the COP also, different exhibitions, different involvements. Then, as my colleagues Beverly and Selma already mentioned, there were, of course, huge marches. There were two main marches. On Friday, there was the march from Fridays for Future, and the other one on Saturday was the Global Day for Climate Justice from the COP26 coalition, where more than 100,000 people were participating in the march, and of course, many more were watching and documenting. I share the opinion of my former panelists that the atmosphere was mesmerizing. It was very engaging. It was wonderful to see, and people were really full of motivation, full of energy. And I think that that climate march was also very well documented in the press and on TV. So two observations is that maybe you heard in the press that the nuclear lobby was very present at the COP, apart from the fossil lobby, which was really lobbying a lot inside of the main COP venue. The nuclear lobby, they were also very much present outside of the main venue. They infiltrated the marches, so they had a huge block during the Fridays for Future march and also on the Saturday march. They were present everywhere, and it was interesting to see how well organized they are, and that they are pushing their agenda for including nuclear energy in the taxonomy, for saying that nuclear energy is clean energy. The other fact I would like to mention is that the indigenous people were very present during the march on Saturday. There was a special indigenous peoples block, which was also very attractive for the media. And of course, it's also always questionable if you put them so much in the front, how you present them, and also if they are only shown by pictures and not being allowed to speak or direct or address a message to the public. So I observed a lot of pictures without words from indigenous people during the march. Apart from that, these two big marches, Extinction Rebellion was very present during the 2 weeks. And also other activists were staging marches, manifestations nearly every day. So nearly every day they were around Glasgow and in the center, manifestations and occupations. For example, JP Morgan, the big bank, was addressed. There were special marches against fossil fuel, fossil energy. Extinction Rebellion was occupying the space outside of Banco de Santander, where there was a huge stunt happening in the street where they were blocking streets, they were blocking bridges. So all these actions happened. Some of them were successful. I would mention, for example, the projector wars. That's the name on Twitter they were given. So every evening on the main venue, the exhibition center, there was an official projection of the COP26, and some evenings Extinction Rebellion inscenated their projection was where they tried to send other messages. Some of these actions were very successful, and the question, of course, is it influencing any way? So is it just art pour art? Well, yeah, I think you understand it, like action for being in action, or how does it influence the negotiators? How does it really have an influence on the decisions being taken, or is it finally just a nice to have, nice to watch action by activists, which we encourage, of course, and which we like, but that doesn't explain how much it is influencing the real negotiations. Then there was the People's Summit for Climate Justice. That was from the COP26 coalition, a 4-day event all around Glasgow. You see there were 13 venues, and there were all the time panels, workshops, assemblies, movie projections going on. It was very alternative. It was very successful because nearly all venues were crowded all the time. And it was very interesting to see how people, especially feminists and indigenous people, were speaking inside of these venues and inside of the main COP. There was a difference to be seen, and I have one picture I want to show you from an indigenous women's panel, which was happening one evening, and it was inside of a theater. What I saw is that people were very much at ease. There was no moderator, there was no one inviting them on stage, but these people took the stage and they decided on the agenda, and no one was giving them the space that day, but they just had it. And that's my observation from that, from the People's Coalition. The question is, of course, did people inside of the main COP realize this? Did they see it? Did they watch the screenings on the internet, on social media? What did they notice about this? Another question is, does such a People's Summit need a main COP as a reason for happening, or could this also happen by itself? Because what was happening inside was wonderful and very fruitful at its own. Does it need the main COP? Or yeah, those are questions to be raised. You see other pictures from me. I would mention the 3 main topics, themes, which were discussed during that event. That was grassroots resistance, grassroots movements and their involvement and their needs to be active. Indigenous people were very present. And they were, of course, also all the time explaining their limited access to the COP, and also that from their viewpoint, this COP was not an inclusive event. And another topic which was raised also by my former panelists, was the nature-based solutions, which I discovered especially during a panel on whales and elephants being included in the carbon markets, which is an extreme example of how some of these calculations of nature-based solutions are being made. Of course, it's a little bit funny, and I mean it that way, but it's also an extreme example of explaining a little bit that a nature-based solution sounds very nice, but there are reasons why, especially indigenous people and also some of our partners are criticizing this terminology a lot, and it's worth reading more in detail about it. Glasgow was COP26. There were exhibitions, there were special pop-ups, there was art happening around COP all the time, special film screenings. So when you were walking around COP, around Glasgow, you discovered COP26 everywhere. This meaning, if you had the time to be outside of the main venue, which unfortunately most of the people I talked to inside of the venue, they didn't see this. So this has to be mentioned, that this is something, if you want to get involved also outside of the main venue, then you saw a lot happening. But if you were forced to be inside of the main venue because of negotiations or for other reasons, then you saw a different COP. Birgit and Selma and Beverly already mentioned that the next COP will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh. And I have the news that the after next COP will take place in Abu Dhabi. And of course, the question we as RSTM ask ourselves is, how can civil society participate in the next COPs? Does it participate? In which form? Because as we all mentioned, some of our highlights were definitely the marches and the engagement and activism of people. And this is currently definitely not possible in Egypt or in Abu Dhabi. And it's, I think, also not wanted. So it's important to discuss how does civil society address the choice for the next two venues? What does it mean for civil society involvement? And what are the consequences we as a civil society need to take because of these decisions? The choice is also not really discussed. The choice was also not really well documented or explained to the people who are interested in it. There are reasons that the COP should take place in Africa. This, of course, can be argumented that way, but Sharm el-Sheikh is in Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh is a tourism resort. What does it mean? What is the signal of this? So I will stop here with a picture of me in front of the famous penguin from the Tuvalu pavilion. Tuvalu also used a very direct message campaign, not really diplomatic. I share this way, maybe you saw that during my way of speaking. And the other picture I'm showing is a caricature, stating that we need new, bold, new inaction, not action. Okay, I see, I will now stop sharing my screen. And I will show all people who are still sharing their screen. Beverly, are you still there?
Yes, yes, I'm here.
Can you also show your video? Thank you. Okay, I will just read. Yes, I see in the chat. That's a very good question, which was raised. Like, what does it mean that these venues are being chosen for the COP? Beverly, you already explained your viewpoint on that. It's sad also that that's not really an open process, and it's also very. It has to be seen in a critical way that that there's no argumentation about it. There is no logic behind it. You want to add something to that?
Oh. In relation to the venue, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think if they're really thinking of doing it where you can showcase how we address climate change, definitely a tourist spot would not be the best example. But then again, as we've mentioned, the issue really of being able to freely articulate opinions in relation to climate change should be a great consideration in choosing the venue. Because it's not a question of comfort for government officials, but it's more a question of being able to negotiate, debate, and the issue. I mean, how can we go to COP when if there's some disagreement, how can we protest or march down the streets if it's not even allowed? And Egypt has been very, very clear in its position in relation to this. That's why they're building more prisons more than any other social service facility. So that's something that I think we need to be raising now, as early as now. And hopefully we'll be able to get a venue that's less restrictive, because if we go to Egypt, it will be more exclusive than what we had experienced in Glasgow.
Yes, thank you, Beverly. Birgit, you also wanted to mention something?
Well, in fact, for me, this the fact that the Sharm el-Sheikh was chosen, this choice is the best example for me that the exploitation of the fact that many countries don't really have the possibilities to host such an event. That really shows that this fact is really exploited by certain countries, and especially, I mean, they could have chosen Cairo, so there would have been many more possibilities, but really this tourism hotspot, it's an absolute clear sign. And also the question of Raquel on that, I mean, it's also a sign that they want to draw the attention away from these human rights abuses, from the role of women, etc. So this is very clear, and I think civil society should really address this as early as possible, and really think about participating, or maybe supporting organizations from the global south to be able to participate, to get maybe an inclusive COP, what we just now in Glasgow did not have, and that might also be a possibility for us to focus upon, really to try to get as many partners from the global south to go there, and yeah, really to get their voice heard. So yeah, there's some more questions, I think.
I think the message is very clear that in fact the preparation for the civil society for the next COP, also the positioning, how to join, if to join, starts now. It's very clear that there's also a reason why there are not many articles about the next COPs. It was difficult to find out the venue for the next COPs. It's not really discussed, it's not really wanted. And that means that the civil society needs to address this now and to prepare for it now, to be ready for next year. Okay, I see. Would it make sense to connect with what is left of the 2011 revolution? Yeah, I think it's clear what you mean by this, the Arab Spring in Tunisia, Egypt, and so on. The question is, yeah, if there's still something existing from that time, and how people also in Egypt are addressing this happening in their country. I think that's interesting to watch, and of course to show our solidarity, and if there's a possibility to help them to raise their voices, that's something we should do. Okay, I think, yeah, we're already good in time. Thanks for everyone for joining. Thanks a lot, Beverly, for having the time for us. It's already late in the Philippines. Thanks a lot for joining. It was very interesting for your insights. I hope we meet again soon. And also thanks for all the audience participating in the chat. It was very lively and vivid. You will now, when we close the Zoom, get an invitation just for a small survey, a short survey. It would be nice if you would fill that out. This webinar was recorded, and it will be put on YouTube and Facebook shortly. Thanks a lot, and hopefully see you soon again. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.